Hello YouTube. I've been covering the Elder Scrolls lore on YouTube for nearly 8 full years now, and in that time I've talked about many interesting locations in the Elder Scrolls universe that you may not know about. From a city built in a gigantic walking tree, to a town of cursed humans who were thought to be extinct. Now, today I put all those interesting places in the lore that I've covered over the years into one big video for your watching convenience, with timestamp chapters in case you want to skip something, like this intro. So, have you always wanted to know about Tamriel's most notorious prison, or have you ever heard the name the Battlespire and you always wanted to know what kind of place that is? Well, it's all going to be in this long video, as we're starting with Tamriel's Bermuda Triangle, the Graven Deep, which is a place where all kinds of ships mysteriously disappear. We'll talk about that after the intro. So, the Graven Deep, very much Tamriel's Bermuda Triangle. It's a place straight out of sailor ghost stories, as all those who enter with their ships never return. None know what's inside the Graven Deep, as none have ever returned to tell the tale. Only strange rumors of a green hue in the sky and mysterious storms in the area that seemingly come out of nowhere are told by sailors who came just a little bit too close but managed to escape. However, the veil of mysteries about the Graven Deep has gotten lifted, as we as the player are able to enter the Graven Deep. A sailor and Mages Guild member named Dulev invites us to come along to find the mysteries of the area, and as we depart in his little ship and sail into the Graven Deep, we inevitably get shipwrecked, because massive storms had formed around the ship, and as many ships before it, the ship sinks, and you and Dulev then manage to barely get on shore of a small island in the Graven Deep. Once stranded, you get the opportunity to explore the island's mysteries. While exploring, you can find that the island was once a small outpost of the Dwemer Rurken clan, the Dwemer who'd left Morrowind for Hammerfell during the First Era. I made a video on them in the earlier years of the channel. Narration is not as good, but watch it if you want to know more about the Rurken clan, because the lore is still good despite the narration. Now, these Rurken Dwemer had sailed to this extremely remote part of the Abyssinian Sea to build one of the most advanced facilities of their civilization that we know of. They built a large underwater observatory where they reportedly conducted all kinds of strange research, which was only possible at the very depths of the ocean. But the primary function of the facility was to house a massive Dwemer machine which siphoned magicka from the surface using a strange system of pipes to bring the magical energy to the ocean floor to power a strange apparatus which then influenced the currents and temperature of the sea in order to affect and control the weather above. Using this experimental facility, they were able to create storms, clear the skies, produce incredibly dense fog, and all sorts of other weather effects. It's highly probable that this facility was built around the time of the Dwemer's disappearance, as it doesn't seem to be completely finished and seems to be on the cutting edge of their technology from around the time of their disappearance. It's also highly likely that they built this facility far out into the sea to keep it both a secret and perhaps even make sure that if something went wrong, it would not affect one of their main settlements in Hammerfell. But that part is speculation, as some on Tamriel also speculate that making it in the depths of the sea might just have been a because we can kind of thing, considering that the Dwemer have built bases in more extreme locations for seemingly no reason, like the depths of volcanoes, the insides of glaciers, and even on the edges of the planes of existence. So the true purpose of why it's built this deep under sea we might never know, but I think the secrecy and keeping it away from the main civilization spot in case something went wrong is a pretty good contender theory. That being said, obviously the Dwemer at one point disappeared, and seemingly just before the facility and observatory got fully finished, although the weather control apparatus was already functional. However, as the Dwemer disappeared, so did any knowledge about this already highly secret facility. The facility at Graven Deep was forgotten and would lay dormant until centuries later, when sometime in the First Era, some druids who were migrating from High Rock to the Sistrus Isles stumbled upon the small island in the Abyssinian Sea. They got shipwrecked there, seemingly just because of bad luck, as at that time the area was not yet considered dangerous. One of these shipwrecked druids, a man named Seer, who was back then already known as a bit of an outcast, who other druids knew sometimes dabbled in forbidden magics, found the entrance to the Dwemer facility on the island, and he became very excited. He entered the facility, and when sometime later his fellow druids entered, hoping to find him inside as they were getting a little bit worried, they found themselves under attack by the facility's defenses. Now, despite the defenses, they persevered, but as they reached the central apparatus in the facility, they found that their fellow druid Seer was no longer, as he'd used forbidden arts to turn himself into a lich, a powerful undead. His fellow druids were horrified by what they saw, but then their former ally just straight up killed them, consuming their souls to gain even more power as a lich. And then the newly turned lich got an idea. What if he could absorb even more souls and get even more powerful? And it also just so happened that he found himself in a highly advanced Dwemer facility. So he then took control of the facility and from that point on used the facility to shipwreck everyone who entered the area, controlling the sea currents to make sure that they landed on the island. And then he lured anyone who landed on the island into the Dwemer facility so that he could kill them and consume their souls. This trap is how the Graven Deep got its reputation, as a place where no ship that entered the area ever leaves, as they get shipwrecked on the small island and then lured into the facility where their souls get consumed. Now, we as the player, together with Dulev and anyone you brought to the dungeon, can fight your way towards the Lich and end him once and for all, taking the Dwemer facility away from his control and once again opening the Graven Deep for sea travel. You, your friends and Dulev then escape on a small raft that Dulev built while stranded on the island, and Dulev informs the Mages Guild of the location of the facility, which then likely send a contingent of mages to study the place and the Dwemer apparatus in it. And that's about all I can tell you about the Graven Deep, Tamriel's Bermuda Triangle. Now, up next we will be talking about the Battlespire, a location not technically on Tamriel, but a very interesting location from the Elder Scrolls universe which is accessible from Tamriel, so I think it counts for this video. So, the Battlespire. For starters, the Battlespire is an Imperial Academy of Magic, which specifically educates primarily Imperial High Battle Mages and prospects for the Imperial Shadow Legion, which is the former bodyguard unit of the Emperor during the Septim days. The Shadow Legion, while highly skilled, has always been slightly overshadowed by the Blades, who also have the task to guard the Dragonborn Emperors, but unlike the Blades, the Shadow Legion is officially part of the Imperial Armed Forces and is also used to guard other important figures around the Empire when the Emperor commands them to do so, such as lower members of the royal family or Imperial representatives around the provinces, something which the Blades doesn't do because they only serve the Dragonborn. Each member of the Shadow Legion has to have undergone a proving of their cunning and their magical and physical prowess in a special tournament hosted inside the Battlespire. Only those who came in first and second in this yearly tournament were allowed to join the Shadow Legion, with other prospects either having to wait until the next tournament or take other positions within the Empire's military. So far, pretty normal institution. Well, here comes the interesting part. The Battlespire is not some regular building as you've seen in the images. The Battlespire is an institution based on a large floating rock located somewhere in a pocket dimension, located somewhere between Mundus, Aetherius and Oblivion. In short, Mundus is the mortal plane, so the plane where Tamriel and all the other continents are located in. Aetherius is the plane where all Magicka comes from and souls return to after perishing on Tamriel. Sovngarde is also located in Aetherius. And the stars and sun are holes in the mortal plane which make Aetherius visible to mortals and makes it so that magic can enter our world from Aetherius into Mundus through the stars and the sun. And finally, Oblivion is the place where all the Daedric princes have their planes of existence. Anyway, this pocket realm located between Mundus, Aetherius and Oblivion has sometimes been called the Slipstream, and so I will do so as well in this video. The reason this location is used for the training of powerful Imperial War Mages and members of the Shadow Legion is because due to its location close to Oblivion, it provides easy access to the realms of Oblivion from the Battlespire for training and experimentation purposes. Specifically, it gives access easily to the Soul Cairn, the Chimera of the Desolation, the Shade Perilous and the Havoc Wellhead, realms of Oblivion, which were easily accessible from the Battlespire, with Maroon's Dagon's realm of the Deadlands also being relatively easy to reach from the Battlespire, and other realms also being far easier to reach from the Battlespire than from Tamriel, but they were a bit harder to reach compared to the specific realms that I named earlier. It's been suggested that during their training, the mages that are trained there, so not the Shadow Legion, underwent trials in which they had to go through several realms of Oblivion and do some sort of proving there. Anyway, while Aetherius seems to be inaccessible from the Battlespire, it has been suggested that its closeness to Aetherius does provide it with an abundance of magicka, making advanced experimental magic easier there than on Tamriel. That is why next to a training facility for the Shadow Legion, the Battlespire also functions as an experimentation ground for Imperial sanctioned mages wanting to do magical research or research inside a realm of Oblivion. It is said that the regular mortals who reside in a realm of oblivion for too long, however, eventually turn insane. But something interesting is that the Battlespire, being in a slipstream realm between the mortal realm, oblivion and Aetherius, does not seem to affect the mental state of those inside. On the contrary even, as by residing inside the Battlespire for a while, it's noted that mortal minds can adjust themselves to being in other realms while still partly under the mortal plane's influence. This means that in addition to Oblivion being more easily accessible from the Battlespire, it's also possible to do more long-term research inside Oblivion without damaging your mind if you use the Battlespire as your point of departure and re-entry into Mundus, as your mind can acclimate to the different realms. But since the Battlespire is not located on Mundus, getting there is not as simple as just going into the College of Winterhold. You can just show a weak spell and walk over a bridge. No. The Battlespire is located in the Slipstream, which is only accessible through the so-called Pillar of Light, a portal of sorts located somewhere on Tamriel. We don't know exactly where it is, but some have theorized that it may be somewhere in Craglorn or perhaps near the coast of Hammerfell. It's also theorized that there may be more Pillars of Light around Tamriel, which are probably closely guarded by the Empire. For example, some think that both the White Gold Tower and the Arcane University at one point might have had Pillars of Light, but this one that you see on screen is the only one that we have confirmation of. And as you can see from the surroundings, it's kind of deserty, so that's why people have guessed Craglorn or Coast of Hammerfell. Anyway, the Pillars of Light take those stepping into it to the Weir Gate, the main entrance of the Battlespire, where re-entry into Mundus happens. This is the most conventional way of getting in. However, there is another way to get back to Mundus from the Battlespire, specifically by flying. It's been suggested that one would be able to leave the Battlespire on the back of a dragon, flying back down to Tamriel, and by using a magical airship called the Star Galley, which is able to reach Tamriel by flight as well, through Magicka streams which it sails on. Although it was likely normally only used to explore the direct surroundings of the Battlespire inside the Pocket Realm to, for example, make repairs outside, as we know that the Star Galley has not been used for a very long time to get to Tamriel. The fact that one could fly down to Tamriel, however, could mean that the Battlespire is located somewhere really high up in the air, so high up that one partially leaves the bounds of Mundus and enters that Slipstream realm, but at the same time, if one fell from the Battlespire, one would not land back on Tamriel, so it's possible that the fact that the dragons could fly down to Tamriel simply has to do with the specific properties of the dragons, and that the Star Galley was made with similar properties in mind, as it follows those Magicka streams down. Anyway, exactly how or why the Battlespire was created is unknown, but what we do know is that it's being held in place by 5 mighty Magicka anchors, which are tethered on locations in Tamriel. They are invisible to mortals on Tamriel, and we don't know exactly how these Magicka anchors work, but without the anchors the Battlespire would be doomed and be adrift in the Slipstream realm, as the anchors on Tamriel are connected to anchors on the Battlespire, which are connected to each other by Magicka streams, which the Star Galley seems to have used these Magicka streams to drift back to Tamriel when it flies back to Tamriel. Something we do sort of know is that the Battlespire likely came into use by the mages during the Reman Empire days, so that's the late First Era. Some have also theorized online that the anchors that keep the Battlespire in place were the first thing to be constructed on Tamriel, and then the people built the Battlespire on Tamriel, and subsequently using the power of the anchors and the Magicka streams to lift the Battlespire up into the Slipstream. That is one of the theories of its creation, and it states that the Battlespire was created during the Reman Empire days and was not originally intended to be a training and experimentation ground for battle mages, but rather a launch platform for the Reman Empire to explore other realms, as the emperors at the time had a fascination with exploring other realms, almost like a space program. Those explorers that they sent up were even called menonauts, like astronauts. The theory states that after this quote-unquote space program was dissolved, the Imperial battle mages then claimed the facility to use it as an academy and experimentation ground and training facility, due to its special properties. So that's after the Menonauts abandoned it. Another theory states that the Battlespire was already there, or at least the rock that it's located on, which is shaped like a dragon ironically, was discovered by accident by the Imperial Menonauts, who tried to explore other realms, who then colonized the rock for the Empire. Whether the rock was already dragon-shaped or whether it was done later then is unknown. In my opinion, the first theory is a bit more likely, but let me know what you think, as we don't have any solid answers to what the exact origins of the Battlespire is. Anyway, after the Battlespire came into the hands of Imperial mages, the Spire came under the control of the Spire Council, which are the 5 most important mages present in the Spire. They make day-to-day decisions over the goings-on in the Battlespire, and they answer to the Imperial government, as the government funds the Battlespire, and the Spire reportedly relies on the Imperial government for its steady stream of recruits, and more importantly, resources, as beside the rock that the Spire is located on, there's nothing of note in the Slipstream realm, so food and clean water, for example, apparently all are transported from Tamriel into the Slipstream using the Weir Gate and the Pillar of Light. So, I already told you of how the facility is a proving ground and training ground for the Imperial Shadow Legion, but that's only a fraction of its use, as like I said, the primary function is the education of Imperial battle mages to assist the Imperial Legion. For their education prospects, they are delivered to them to the Spire by the Imperial government between the ages of 10 and 12, so that those are very magical potent children. After which they're trained and kept in the Battlespire until deployment. In the Elder Scrolls Online Blackwood chapter we even have 2 of these battle mages, one full battle mage and one potential, which is the name for a mage in training in the Spire. This potential, Luciana Caprania, can even become a house guest with some really interesting dialogue on the Battlespire. From our dialogue we can discern that the Battlespire is also used to talk to Lower Dremora and apparently learn from Lower Dremora, and that the Spire is equipped with a large array of places to study in isolation, although potentials are kept on a very harsh schedule during their studies. We also know that there's a grand library and study halls and everything required to educate the new generation of battle mages. Something else that's interesting about the Battlespire is that the mages inside do not keep Tamrielic hours. Their sleep rhythm is not based on the Tamrielic night and day, but has seemingly been pushed into optimal hours. The potentials, which after years of training, when they are finally allowed to leave the Battlespire again and return to the mortal plane, have great trouble adjusting to Tamrielic hours apparently, and often barely remember what the sun and the moons look like, as neither are present in the Slipstream, since it's outside of the mortal realm. That said, at the end of the Second Era, when the Septim Empire was formed, the Battlespire came under the control of the Septim Emperors, and they initiated the practice of partially training members of the Shadow Legion at the Spire, next to the training of battle mages. That was its original program for years and years and years until the Septims came along. But it was also during the Septim days that the Battlespire eventually came to its end, as during the Imperial Simulacrum, which is the events of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, when the treacherous battle mage Jaegar Tharn betrayed Emperor Uriel Septim VII, imprisoning him somewhere in Oblivion and taking the Emperor's appearance in order to grab power over the Empire itself. Nobody really knew that this had happened and that Jaegar Tharn had impersonated the Emperor, and everybody just assumed that Emperor Uriel was still with them, but this was just Jaegar Tharn in disguise. You solved this entire situation in the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, but during this period, Jaegar Tharn did fear the battle mages of the Battlespire, specifically the powerful Spire Council, which are 5 of the most powerful mages around the world, or well, outside of the world at that point. So he made a deal with Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedric Prince. If Dagon eliminated the Spire Council and all other mages inside, Mehrunes Dagon could have the Battlespire. Dagon, who didn't really knew of the Battlespire's existence prior to this, agreed, as he saw it as a perfect launch platform for his own invasion of Mundus, the mortal realm, since the Slipstream was a realm between Mundus, Aetherius and Oblivion, so Mehrunes Dagon overran the Battlespire to occupy it as a sort of way forward fortress to eventually invade Mundus. There's some tragic accounts left to read in the Battlespire as you make your way through the game, from people trying to defend it, as slowly the minions of Mehrunes Dagon came out of the Void Gates and completely overwhelmed the mages. The mages were stronger than the minions, but the minions had far greater numbers, and the minions of Mehrunes Dagon had sealed away the Weir Gate so that nobody could leave the Battlespire to ask for reinforcements from Tamriel. Slowly, the entire Battlespire was overran. One battle mage named Samar Starlover tried to escape the Spire on the back of a friendly dragon, which was, by the way, one of the very few dragons left in the world, and was actually there to help the mages in their research. An interesting case. But that dragon was killed by Dagon's minions before Starlover could escape on his back, and Samar Starlover died by the friendly dragon's side, after being completely overran by Mehrunes Dagon's minions. This is where the plot of Battlespire picks up. You're a prospect for the Imperial Shadow Legion and you have no idea of the carnage that is taking place inside the Battlespire, as again nobody could leave to tell anyone on Tamriel about it. You pass through the Pillar of Light to enter your proving and then walk through the Weir Gate, because it turns out that the gate is only sealed in one direction, as the entry is still possible from Tamriel. But also there's no way back for you to get back to Tamriel because the gate is sealed. So you venture forth and in the end you manage to free the Battlespire from its occupying forces and banish Maroon's Dagon in his own realm of oblivion, putting him out of commission for at least some time, allowing you to return to Tamriel. But after this invasion, the Battlespire was severely damaged, so severely that the commission created by the Emperor to assess the damages straight up recommended to abandon the Battlespire, as repairing it and training new personnel to head it would be such a massive investment that the Empire could not afford to pay it, and should rather divert its resources to keeping the Empire together after the chaos that Jaeger Tharn's rule had caused across the provinces. But even if they had diverted their resources to repairing the Battlespire, it wouldn't have nearly been as useful to the mages as before, as according to a man who ventured secretly into the Battlespire through one of its still functioning Pillars of Light, all links to Oblivion inside the Battlespire were broken after the invasion and no portals to any Oblivion realms remained open, or were able to be opened again. So while the Shattered Academy still remained accessible and he could walk through the ruins, it was no longer as useful as the interplane exploration point, and because none of it was possible anymore. Anyway, that was all I can tell you about the Battlespire, a topic I often wanted to get into but never really did because I couldn't get the game working, but again, with a lot of effort in my holiday, I managed to get everything that I needed at least. But since the Elder Scrolls Online mentioned the Battlespire again last year, it seemed time, as I would not be surprised if a new Elder Scrolls Online chapter next year, or maybe the year after, takes us to the Battlespire. Anyway, if it happens, I called it. Alright, having talked about the Battlespire, now let's talk about one of Tamriel's most grim places, the Blackrose Prison. For centuries the most notorious prison on Tamriel and a place you definitely would not want to be locked up in. So let's see what the Blackrose Prison is all about. In the Elder Scrolls Online, deep in the marshes of Blackmarsh, in the northwestern parts of the Murkmire region, there stands a large Imperial ruin. This ruin is all that remains of the Blackrose Prison, a prison built during the Second Cyrodiilic Empire period under the Akaviri potentate Hakoshae. This ruin once housed some of Tamriel's most notorious criminals. But let's start at the beginning. During the early Second Era, after the death of the last Reman Emperors, the reign of the Akaviri potentates began. If you want to know more about them, I suggest you watch my video on the Reman Empire. It's a bit old, but it still contains all the necessary info. The Akaviri potentate, Hakoshae, who had many enemies, wanted a distant prison built where he could have the worst criminals of the Empire, and his biggest political enemies, imprisoned. The choice for the location soon fell on Blackmarsh, as for centuries already under the Reman Emperors, political enemies would basically be exiled to the unforgiving swamps of the province. But Hakoshae wanted an actual prison built there, bigger and more secure than any other prison at the time. He commissioned his powerful battle mage, an elf by the name of Peladil Durrani, to build this new prison. As the battle mage went to work on it, he chose for its location an abandoned village, once inhabited by the now extinct Lilmuthid, south of the city of Blackrose. This location was chosen for its relative isolation, as it was completely surrounded by a harsh environment, and it was almost a day's ride away from any civilization. Prisoners would also not be able to flee into the marshes, as not far from the prison, the marshes became so impenetrable for non-Argonians that non-Argonians would basically not survive in there. It's passed down in legend that the entire prison complex was built in just a single day upon the ruins of the Lilmuthid village by Peladil Durrani, with the help of an army of storm Atronachs that he conjured. While this is probably an exaggeration, it can be said that the prison was built in a record speed and with the help of Atronachs. And from that moment on, when the prison was finished, the worst criminals of the Empire and many political prisoners were sent to this fearsome new prison. In the book History of the Blackrose Prison, it's quite literally stated that this is where men and mer alike were sent when the reigning power wished to never see them again, meaning that when they were sent there, they probably would never return. And the fact that prisoners from, for all terms and purposes, were never just, intended to return to society, the prison staff, consisting of both Imperials and Atronachs, had nearly no accountability, doing basically as they pleased with the prisoners. There were many cases of brutality and torture, prisoners basically being chained to walls, whippings and many other cruelties reserved for those who were unfortunate enough to land on the bad side of potentate Hakoshae and his son. But not only prisoners from abroad were sent here, also the rebellious Naga Argonians were en masse locked up in the prison, with almost half of the inmates consisting of local rebels that were just, for convenience sake, locked up in this prison. It's said that these Naga Argonians in particular were treated even worse by the prison staff than the men and Mur imprisoned in the notorious prison. Eventually, when Hakoshae was assassinated and his son Severin Chorak, the second Akaviri potentate, also mentioned in that video that I mentioned earlier, was eventually assassinated as well, the Second Empire fell apart and disintegrated. Amidst the chaos of the Empire disintegrating, the garrison at the prison got cut off from the Empire's support and communication. This made it so that after a while of being cut off from the Empire, the prison population was able to revolt against the Imperial wardens. It's said that the insurrection at the prison was short and swift, as the prisoners slaughtered the Imperial guards that had kept them there and that had passed so much cruelty upon them. But the story of the prison doesn't really end there, as once the guards were taken care of, the Naga Argonian prisoners then murdered their fellow non-Argonian prisoners. These Naga then claimed the prison for themselves, proclaiming a new clan of prison survivors. Unfortunately, the rest of the clans of Blackmarsh did not accept their bid to become a new clan, as chaining themselves to a stone building, the remains of the prison, went against Argonian culture and belief at the time, and thus the group of prisoners would simply keep to themselves, eventually becoming what we know as the Blackguards, a clan consisting of not only Argonians but outcasts as well, from other races, described by other Argonians as not better than mere bandits. They held the prison for years, eventually turning it into their own gauntlet test of strength under their leader Drakidi Unchained. It's possible to traverse this gauntlet in the Elder Scrolls Online in order to save someone who is being held by the Blackguards, but it's a hard dungeon and I can't recommend it, unfortunately, unless you have multiple people who know what they're doing and are at a high level. That said, after the Second Era, the story of the prison actually continues, as this is not just a piece of lore added by Elder Scrolls Online, it's just something that had already existed in lore, but which Elder Scrolls Online incorporated. Because after the Tiber Wars and the founding of the Third Empire, what was left of the prison at that point, the old prison, was taken and occupied by the new empire under the Septims, and the Septims had the entire facility repaired and started using it for the same purposes as their ancient Akaviri predecessor had used it for, with many dangerous criminals and political enemies being sent there over the years. Among the prisoners in the Septim dynasty were those who helped the treacherous Jaegar Tharn overthrow Emperor Uriel Septim VII. His henchmen were imprisoned there after the Eternal Champion of the Elder Scrolls I Arena, which is the player of Arena, managed to defeat Jaegar Tharn in the story. The last that we know of the Blackrose Prison is that somewhere between Morrowind and Oblivion, in time sense, a large-scale prison break with several dangerous individuals escaping into the swamp occurred. While none of these prisoners presumably survived the treacherous marches, they might have, but the Imperial government hasn't disclosed any names on who was escaped there. Would be cool though to see, a survivor of the Blackrose Prison, if we ever get a game set after Oblivion or between Oblivion and Morrowind. Probably not, but hey, who knows. That's basically what we know of the prison. We don't know how the prison is faring in the Fourth Era, other than that it's likely no longer in Imperial hands, as by the year 10 of the Fourth Era, Blackmarsh seceded from the Empire under the Anselil, their Argonian nationalistic government. So it's unlikely that it's still in Imperial hands, but that said, we do know that the Anselil are far less traditional than their counterparts in the Second Era, and that they actually live in stone buildings again. And they are a relatively dictatorial government over Blackmarsh. This means that the Argonians might now actually use the prison for their own enemies now, but unfortunately we don't know anything about that.
And that's about all I can say about the Blackrose Prison, a pretty grim place. So now let's talk about a place which is far less depressing and more fun to visit, Tamriel's biggest zoo, the Silvar Woad Zoo. So, the Silvar Woad Zoo, or Menagerie, is a large zoo located on the southeastern coast of Eleanor, the biggest island in the Somerset Isles group. It exhibits animals from all over Tamriel, from every corner of the continent. Now, while the zoo is quite impressive, I do have to give some really quick context. In the Elder Scrolls Online we can visit the zoo, and thus I got most of my footage for this video there. However, the quest at the zoo revolves around the animals having escaped their enclosure, so if the zoo seems a bit run down in the footage, yeah, it is. But it's the only footage that we have, unfortunately. Well, I mean, luckily, because it doesn't always happen that we even have footage of any place in the lore. Now, anyway. According to some of the in-game books that we can find, the Silvar Woad Zoo is actually one of the most popular places for high elves from all over the Somerset Isles to visit, with it being one of the top destinations for family trips for well-off high elves. The zoo in-game is quite limited in size, like almost everything in Elder Scrolls games, but in the lore it's quite massive, big enough to apparently walk around in for days. It has one of the biggest collections of exotic animals from all around the continent, and in the game we can see it has lions from elsewhere, and Cyrodiil, mammoths from Skyrim, dune rippers from Hammerfell, Echetaris from Northern High Rock, Chubloons from Skyrim, mystical Indrix from the Somerset Isles, and in the lore it apparently has many more animals. For example, I wouldn't be surprised if in the lore they had Morrowind's Netches and Quamas, for example, or gigantic wasps and crocodiles from Blackmarsh. As in the lore it's advertised as having animals from every corner of Tamriel, and we know that it's far bigger in the lore than what we see in the game, so wouldn't surprise me. Now, next to exotic animals, they also house some quite mundane, mostly cute animals in a small petting zoo in a separate part of the zoo that children seem to be able to interact with, stuff like sheep, deer, and baby Echetaris, which are actually quite cute. Now, that being said, the zoo itself is owned by the royal family of Eleanor, who has opened it up to public visitation. Now, while the zoo is open to the public and acts like an attraction of sorts to the people of the Somerset Isles, in fact it's simply the private animal collection of the royal family. This means that while most parts of the zoo are publicly viewable, some parts of the zoo are reserved for the royal family and their favorite animals. For example, Queen Irene, when she was still a princess, often visited the zoo to visit her childhood pet Indrik named Lotus. Now, a small legion of zookeepers feed the animals and care for the animals, including the private animals of the royal family. It's this small legion of loyal zookeepers who keep the place running, with the zoo also having a quite sizable ranger force in order to keep dangerous animals at bay in case something happens. Finally, the zoo itself is run by the person with the title of Head Conservator, and that person is tasked with leading the zookeepers and the rangers, and just taking care of day-to-day operations of the zoo. And, talking about the zookeepers, we learned that due to the extremely high standards of animal care that the Eleanor royal family demands from the zookeepers, becoming a zookeeper is quite hard. You see, because of the high variety of animals in the zoo, it can take up to 50 years of being a junior keeper in apprenticeship before one can become a full-fledged keeper, who are expected to know everything about each animal in the zoo. Because of this, for those 50 years as a junior zookeeper, you will never work alone with the animals, and a full-fledged zookeeper who acts as a tutor is always required to be with you. Now, while 50 years may sound long, and to be fair, it is, for the high elves who have quite a long lifespan, that isn't really all too much of an issue. Now, next to the rangers and the keepers, there are presumably a whole staff of people selling snacks and other food and drink at the zoo, as the zoo has many amenities for relaxing and eating with the family while, having a break from viewing animals. I kinda sound like an advertisement here, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows, because as we discover during the Elder Scrolls Online's quest in the zoo, things can also go horribly wrong there, because as it turns out, during the time of the Elder Scrolls Online, the head conservator was a staunch opponent of Queen Irene and her policies of opening up Eleanor to foreigners. Therefore, the head conservator secretly conducted experiments on the zoo's magical creatures, which usually did not survive the ordeal of those experiments. Now, in the game we try to save Queen Irene's pet Indrik, Lotus, from one of those experiments, and we discover that the head conservator was actually trying to turn these magical Indriks into fearsome monsters who would attack foreigners on the islands. Which is actually quite vile, as Indriks are quite holy and magical creatures, and as you'll see in a future video that I'll probably make on Indriks, these experiments may have done a lot of damage, as Indrik's souls are said to never truly leave the mortal plane, meaning that their souls may be forever damaged, as Indriks are said to be reincarnated, so the next reincarnation may have permanent damage because of what has been done to them. But more on that in a future video on Indriks. Now, that being said, after the quest, the people who've been thinking during this story those animals shouldn't be in captivity, they get the opportunity to free all the animals from the zoo, or you can put someone in charge of the zoo who has a good reputation and genuinely cares about the animals instead of the zookeeper who experimented on the animals. Me personally, I put him in charge because I feel like the Eleanor royal family will likely reopen the zoo anyway at some point and will likely fire the guy who actually cares about the animals for helping you with setting them free, so it's probably better to leave him in charge there. But hey, that's just me. Tell me in the comments what you did or would do.
That said, we do know that after the Septim Empire conquered the Somerset Isles in the late 2nd era, in the 3rd era they renamed the place to Silver Wood instead of the Elvish Silvar Woad, and during the 3rd era a town had formed in the region. Whether the zoo was still operational all those years later we don't know, as the lore wasn't that developed during the time of the Elder Scrolls 1 arena. So yeah, do let me know what you think, whether or not it's still operating after all those years. Anyway, that's the story of the Silvar Woad Zoo. Now let's talk about one of Tamriel's coolest places by far, the gigantic walking wood elf city of Falinesti, one of Valenwood's biggest cities, and it's built in a gigantic walking tree. So, let's talk about it. So, Falinesti. Historically it's been one of the biggest cities in Valenwood, with one of the highest densities of wood elf population. Apparently population-wise it's only rivaled by the city of Eldenroot, which can be seen as a sister city of sorts. Because just like Eldenroot, Falinesti was built into a gigantic Elden tree, an extremely large species of tree related to the mighty Grad Oaks of Valenwood, which are the biggest species of tree found on all of Tamriel, as we talked about in my video on the tree species of Tamriel. Now apparently, according to Bosmerry legend, all of these Grad Oaks and their relative species were once able to walk around freely on their roots, with almost all deciding to root down somewhere permanently during the Meretic era. According to those legends, Falinesti's Elden Tree was an exception to this, and instead of permanently rooting down somewhere, the city would continue to wander across the jungles of Valenwood for eternity. Now, whether this is true or not, we don't know. We know very little to begin with about how it walks, only that it does walk, or at least move, and that it moves between 4 sites for every season of the year. As such, it has a spring, summer, autumn and winter site, where it temporarily roots down every year for some time, only to then start walking towards the next site. Because of this predetermined pattern, some have speculated that it were ancient wood elves in the middle to late Meretic era who actually enchanted the tree's roots and pre-programmed it, so to say, so it would walk across the province in emulation of massive creatures out of legends. Which of those theories is true, we don't know. However, the people of Valenwood do seem to believe that the tree itself is the driving force behind its travels, since apparently sometimes it deviates from its usual routes, sometimes walking for days, sometimes walking for weeks towards the next site, and it doesn't really seem to have anyone steering the tree. It seems to do everything by itself. On top of that, some people sometimes call it the massive tree beast, as if it's a creature. So I personally lean more towards the idea that it's a massive creature of sorts that the Bosmer have built a city in, but I suppose we will only find out if we ever get to visit the city and learn more about it. That being said, while there's a lot that we don't know about its origins and movement, there are some things that we do know about the legendary walking city. For one, we know its route. We know the city roots down in spring in the southwest of Valenwood, then it strides to the northwest in summer. In autumn it then walks east towards the Elsewhere border, where it roots down until winter comes again, when it moves down towards the south of Valenwood to the southwest, only to then return to the spring side once again when spring comes. In that way it walks in a circle every year. We know that the city, when it comes to any of the rooting places, drives its roots deep into the ground, sometimes into existing tunnels, to anchor itself to the earth. And we know that in the process of getting back up for its next walk in the coming season, that costs immense amount of force to get the roots back out of the ground. In the few days prior to the city resuming its yearly trek, the Bosmer of the city can feel the tree rumble violently every once in a while, with the tree's green and golden leaves falling down like a rain to the ground below. This must be quite a challenge for the many Bosmer living in both the tree's bowels and across its many sprawling branches, as I just imagine all their stuff falling over like with earthquakes. But despite this hassle, the Bosmer of the city tend to celebrate the uprooting, so when the city resumes to walk, and they also celebrate the rooting, so when it settles down for a season again, as both are accompanied with elaborate ceremonies. In accordance with the Green Pact, Bosmer may not harm the trees of Valenwood in any way, shape or form. This is why, just like in all other Bosmer cities, the houses and other living spaces in Falinesti have all been magically created by shaping the branches, bowels and stem of the tree during their growth and making them artificially grow using magic. This is why Bosmer houses all across the province, and probably also those of Falinesti, are always kind of pod-shaped, because the Bosmer shaped them during their growth and cannot alter them using tools or weapons. This is why all the living spaces in the city, including a whole palace, are all grown out of the tree rather than built in the tree. But it doesn't end at living spaces, as the Bosmer have also magically shaped many platforms and walkways out of the branches as narrow makeshift streets between the living pods in the canopy of the tree, and they even tend to control vines using magic that have platforms attached to them as makeshift elevators in order to get around the city levels in the tree's massive canopy, which is divided into several city districts and thus has several sort of streets and highways and even these moving platforms between them. Now, as I mentioned, the city is divided into several districts, because most Bosmer in the city seems to live either in the tree's bowels or in the stem, or across the many branches in the city's massive canopy. And it seems that Bosmer of lower standing live lower in the tree, so either in the tree's stem, bowels, or lower in the canopy, with higher in the canopy being the Bosmer of the highest standing, with a large magically grown palace at the very top of the branches where the Bosmer Camoran kings used to settle. You see, because of the city's immense size and its mobility, being a walking city that roams all across Valenwood, the city has historically functioned as the capital of Valenwood, from where the Camoran kings of Valenwood ruled the province, with the city's mobility making it easy to bring the entire court along across the province. Now, somewhere during the early Second Era, between 200 and 500 years before the Elder Scrolls Online takes place, when Valenwood was part of the Cyrillic Empire, then under the reign of the Akaviri potentates, first Rushe and Severian Chorak, something extremely strange happened at that time. Falinesti unrooted itself, started walking, and it just disappeared mysteriously. Nobody knows where it went, nobody knows why it went away, whether the tree itself chose to disappear or whether it was somehow abducted. We don't know. What we do know is that all its inhabitants magically disappeared with it, a traumatic experience of those left behind, as we have seen examples both in lore and in-game in the Elder Scrolls Online of families being literally ripped apart as family members are stuck on the city, which is now nowhere left to be found, while others are still outside the city, now searching for the city and their missing family members. Who can't even be sure whether or not those people in the city are even still alive. And not only Bosmer disappeared, both some wood orcs and the Imga, a primitive and pretty hilarious species of intelligent apes native to Valenwood, they all disappeared alongside the city. While some tribes of wood orcs still remain in Valenwood, the Imga all but disappeared, mysteriously alongside the city, with many Bosmer speculating that the Imga are either all in the city, wherever it may be now, or the remaining Imga retreated into the deeper jungles of Valenwood to desperately search for the city where their fellow Imga and friends are now captured, which is then why we don't see them in the game. There are many conspiracy theories about why the city disappeared. Some think it walked into the sea, some think a god or Daedra abducted it and now is stuck in some obscure realm somewhere. Some think it's now on one of Tamriel's moons, and others again think it's somehow walking back or forward in time, which is why we don't see it in the present in the Elder Scrolls Online. Others think it may have something to do with some celestial chicken. Literally, this is all in the game. But, you know, the theory on walking forward or backwards in time, especially forwards, may be right, since we don't know anything about what happened to the city, but we do know that the city mysteriously reappeared at some point before the Third Era. But I personally think that the theory of a god or a Daedric prince capturing the city somehow and bringing it to their realms is a bit more likely. Because you see, in the Elder Scrolls Online, we have several quests at the seasonal sites, you know, the sites where Falinesti historically used to root for 1/4 of the year. One of those quests at those sites implies that the Khajiit trickster god Regine may have taken the city to some other realm, and one other site implies that Mephala might have done it, you know, a Daedric prince. And I'm speculating here and expect a follow-up video if this is the case. But in ZeniMax's recent Elder Scrolls Online new chapter tease, the good people of the UESP actually spotted some Mephala-related symbols and references to Falinesti, so I can definitely see rescuing Falinesti from some Oblivion realm it landed in because of Mephala as a good potential plotline. But we will have to see about that. I may be wrong and we may not get any answers regarding Falinesti and its disappearance, but still, it's interesting to think about. Either way, there are many Bosmer who fervently believe that the city will one day return to them and reappear just as mysteriously as it one day disappeared. They call themselves the Falinesti Faithful, and they tend to the different sites that the city once called home, aiming to keep them unoccupied and ready for when the city one day returns. And they were right, as we don't know how or when, but the city one day returned and was once more made the capital of Valenwood, with the Camoran kings returning to their palace in the city. That having been said, we don't really know how the Camoran rulers even escaped the disappearance, because in the Elder Scrolls Online we have King Camoran Eredon, or Eredon Camoran, but he's been king for only 100 years or so, maybe less, so when he became king, Falinesti was already long gone. How one of the kings before him escaped Falinesti, we don't know, especially since that used to be the seat of the kings. Perhaps the king at the time even disappeared with the city, and his cousin or son or any other relative who wasn't in Falinesti might have taken over. That would make for quite an interesting plotline where we have to visit the city during the Elder Scrolls Online if the old king or queen still lives, but that's far too much speculation for me, so let's keep it grounded in what we know for now.
For one, we know that during the Septim Empire, when Tiber Septim and his heirs ruled Valenwood, they kept the Comoran kings on as their provincial rulers and allowed them to keep themselves based in the city of Falinesti. In addition to that, by the end of the Third Era, a bit before the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, the city has apparently rooted itself for far longer than normal, seemingly at the summer site, with some speculating that it might have finally rooted itself for good, just like all the other trees, if the Bosmer legend proves to be the right theory. But we haven't heard anything on that since the time of Oblivion, so between Oblivion and Skyrim, it may just have uprooted itself again and started walking again. The only bit of 4th era information that we have on Falinesti is that it also falls under the Altmerry Dominion and is now under Thalmor rule, which prior to the Great War, some kind of Blades operation against the Thalmor has taken place in the city of Falinesti. It's called the Falinesti Incident, in which Esbern of the Blades apparently played some kind of role, but we don't know anything more other than the name of the incident, which is the Falinesti Incident. Now, while Falinesti is a really big city, now let's talk about a far smaller place, the town of Hakoshae, a town in the northern regions of Elsewhere which has the descendants of Akaviri invaders who had offspring with Tamriel's humans living in it. And it has upheld Akaviri traditions for a long time, making this a particularly interesting village, so let's talk about it.
Akavir and Tamriel had always been separated. The two continents knew of each other's existence, but never truly disturbed one another. However, during the late First Era, a force of Akaviri Saisi, who are speculated to be a type of vampiric snake people, invaded Tamriel from Akavir. Their exact motives for this invasion never truly become clear to us, but many speculate that they were searching for a Dragonborn. And as the forces of Tamriel's humans came to meet the Akaviri invaders head-on, the Akaviri invaders were confronted by the then king, Reman Cyrodiil I, who was Dragonborn, and upon hearing his voice as Dragonborn, the Saisi warriors laid down their arms and swore fealty to the Dragonborn, swearing to serve him and his Dragonborn descendants. A large part of this Akaviri invading force would go on to become the Dragon Guard and later also found the Fighters Guild. The Saisi on Tamriel would go on to become venerated for their military prowess and be a great factor in why the Empire and the Reman Cyrodiil and his descendants were able to expand the way that it did. The Saisi would from that moment on mingle with Cyrodiil's Imperial population. This meant that many of the high-ranking Saisi bred into Cyrodiilic families and were able to start their own lineage on Tamriel. The original Akaviri, due to their blind devotion to the Dragonborn Emperors, would go on to become great generals and powerful politicians under the reign of the Reman Emperors, but none were as powerful as one of the original Saisi from the invasion, Versaduce. He had been among the original invasion and thus was still a pure-blood Serpent Man of Akavir, or at least speculated Serpent Man. He had presumably risen through the ranks of the Empire over the many years since the invasion, and by the time of the last Reman Emperor, Emperor Reman Cyrodiil III, he had become the Emperor's closest advisor and had been named Steward over the Empire while Reman III was on military campaign. However, Versadu was a very shrewd politician, and instead of blindly serving the Dragonborn Emperors, he rather focused on his own goals and maximizing his own power. This meant that he made sure that instead of a new emperor on the throne of Cyrodiil, Versaduce himself took power as potentate, as an interim ruler over the empire when Emperor Reman Cyrodiil III and his son both died under mysterious circumstances, which are widely believed to have been orchestrated by Versaduce, of course, because, you know, he came out with a lot of power, but it's never truly been proven that Versaduce was responsible for the death of the emperor and his son. Potentates are supposed to rule only for a very short time until a new emperor can be appointed. However, the rule of the Akaviri potentate, Versaduce, lasted for well over 300 years until he was finally assassinated by the Morak Tong in the year 324 of the Second Era, after which his son, Severian Chorak, took power after a supposedly short power struggle. Severian Chorak then outlawed the Morak Tong, however this mattered not, as a little over 100 years after his own reign began, he was also assassinated by the remnants of the Morak Tong along with all of his heirs. With the position of Emperor vacant and nobody to legitimately succeed the Akaviri potentate, then the interregnum began and the Reman Empire finally fell apart as everybody scrambled for power, as nobody really had a solid claim to power within the empire. That was an extremely short crash course of the history needed to understand what we will be talking about today in this video, the Akaviri town of Hakoshae. You see, with the murder of Severian Chorak and his heirs, many people of Akaviri descent in Cyrodiil felt very scared and unwelcome. This meant that many of them fled the province. The large majority of them fled to elsewhere, founding new towns in the north of the province and co-inhabiting with the Khajiit in the already existing cities, like for example Rimmon. However, over the centuries, these Akaviri bloodlines became muddy and eventually faded into obscurity, with only remainders of their influence being the large tombs of Akaviri descendants buried in traditional manner in the north of Elsewhere. Of which we can, by the way, also find a tomb in the Elder Scrolls Online, which also has a side quest in it. One of the only towns where Akaviri bloodline stayed relatively pure was the town of Hakoshae in northern Elsewhere. This town remained relatively isolated throughout its existence and wasn't often mingling with outsiders, trying to retain Akaviri culture, as even there the bloodlines slowly faded as they became more and more like regular Imperials instead of Imperials with Akaviri descent. This town was relatively prosperous for decades since the Interregnum began, persisting even into the 6th century of the Second Era, the years that the Elder Scrolls Online take place. This is where we find the town during our playthrough, calm and relatively isolated, still upholding many of the Akaviri traditions. However, as we approach the town, you see someone familiar standing by the gates, a dark elf named Asher. He was an assassin of the Morak Tong. And when you speak to him, he tells you that it was his grandfather, also an assassin of the Morak Tong, who was tasked with assassinating one of the last heirs of the Akaviri potentate Severin Chorak. His father and the heir then both disappeared after the assassination attempt, and the Morak Tong presumed that the assassin had been killed after assassinating the heir. But now, more than 2 centuries since that assassination, Asher had caught on to a rumor that the current leader of the town, Magnate Fena Darak, is actually in secret a descendant of the potentate. If this is true, that means that his grandfather actually failed in his assassination of the heir, which would be a grave dishonor to Asher's family name, meaning that Asher needs to find out whether this rumor of the magnate's inheritance is true or not. And if it is, he has to complete his grandfather's contract by finishing off the Akaviri potentate's last heir. You then agree to help Asher find out about the magnate's heritage, either because you like murder, or because you hope to prove that the magnate's rumored inheritance is false, so she doesn't have to be assassinated. As you enter the traditional town, you find it in the midst of a festival, called the Proving Festival. This festival is an ancient Akaviri tradition that's being held in the town for the first time since its foundation. And when you speak to the magnate Fena Darak herself, she tells you that this festival has the people of Hakoshae prove themselves to their ancestors by completing 3 proofs, or trials, after which the ancestors will judge them. This festival is ancient and was first held in Akavir and last held at the town's foundation, but then quickly forgotten about after the town's foundation for some reason. She then explains that she found records of the first festival being held at the town and then decided to hold one again in order to honor their Akaviri ancestry, as while their Imperial bloodline runs much thicker than their Akaviri blood, the town of Hakoshae wishes to stay as close to their Akaviri ancestors as possible by at least upholding their traditions and trying to learn the language a little bit. It's said that depending on how the ancestors judge the inhabitants, they will either send good or bad luck from the afterlife, and it's said that if they are greatly angered for some reason, the spirit of an ancestor can actually come back to this world of the living after the ritual, because the ritual is a sort of invite for them to come over and right the wrong that they're angered about. For example, there's an ancient Akaviri legend about a woman proclaiming that she was cleverer than all her ancestors, something which rightly angered one of her ancestors, who then came back to Nirn to either have her prove herself against him or die by his hand. You then decide to participate in the proving ritual in order to get the trust of the magnate, and after the festival maybe have her reveal something to you about her heritage, and then you go through the 3 trials. The trial of reverence, which consists of letting a lotus flow down the river, the trial of strength, which has you steal a flower from a lion's den, and then the proof of wisdom, where you need to answer a riddle. After completing all 3 trials, you return to the magnate, but she tells you nothing more than that she leads the village because her family originally founded it. Of course, this is no concrete proof of her heritage, and thus Asher tells you that he will need something more concrete, meaning that you two will break into the magnate's basement and then study the records there. Among the records in the magnate's basement, you will find a letter from her late mother telling her to be secretive about her heritage to the potentate, as the Morak Tong still haunts the Tamriel shadows and will kill her if she lets it come out. This is, of course, about as concrete as proof gets, and your assassin buddy Asher then wants to kill the magnate, but before he gets a chance, a vengeful Akaviri spirit appears and abducts the magnate after shouting at the magnate that she dishonors him by claiming to be of his blood. The spirit then takes her away before Asher can even go in for his kill, and you two are basically left without any clue. But then Asher thinks, wait, I think that the spirit took her to the local tomb, and then you two go to the local tomb, where you suspect that the magnate is being held by the spirit. When you arrive at the tomb, you find that not only has the spirit of her ancestor returned out of anger, but a whole slew of his soldiers as well, who fight you in the tomb in order to keep you away from the magnate and her captor. You then fight your way through the tomb, vanquishing all the spirits until you're in the tomb's central space, where the Shade of the Founder is waiting for you with the abducted magnate. After fighting the spirit then tells you that he respects your prowess after besting him in combat, and wishes for you to talk to him. He then explains that Fenadarak has called on his spirit, the spirit of Proconsul Beloran Kay, heir of the Potentate. But despite Fenadarak's belief that he was her ancestor who would judge her for all that she has done for Hakoshae, it turns out that he isn't her ancestor, rather he was killed by the Morag Tong, after which his bodyguard, Lieutenant Lane Barduk, looted his body and then fled to the place where he would found the Hakoshae and claimed to be the proconsul to those who had arrived, essentially stealing the proconsul's heritage, meaning that the proconsul is now returned from the dead in order to have revenge for all the centuries that Fenadarak's family unknowingly used his name and fame, despite not being his descendants. It is then also revealed that this is the second time that he has returned, as during the town's foundation he had already returned once to enact revenge upon his former bodyguard, but this attempt failed, after which the Proving Festival was never held again at the town in order to prevent his return. Until then, because current magnate Fenadarak decided to hold the festival again after finding records of it, which allowed him to return and eventually, enact his revenge. The spirit then demands that Fenadarak either be killed or announce that her false ancestry is false. Fenadarak can barely believe that the fact that her ancestor lied is true and is hesitant about renouncing her ancestry, but ultimately she decides to tell everybody in the town the truth, as she says that her people deserve nothing short of the full honesty if it comes to her family's reputation. She then tells the town the truth, and to her surprise, nobody really cares, and she remains the leader of the town, as she's led it very well so far, and something that her ancestor did doesn't really matter to the town's inhabitants. Asher is also satisfied and leaves again onto his next writ, because, no reason to kill the Potentate's ancestor now, because there is no Potentate's descendant. And the spirit of the proconsul also returns to the afterlife, finally being satisfied. This concludes the story of Hakoshae, but before I end things, I quickly want to say something, as when we were playing this quest for research, my friend who I was playing it with said that the proconsul's spirit, a direct descendant of Verstuche and Sarvir in Chorak, proves definitively that the Akaviri Seisi were humans and not serpent vampires, as clearly this spirit is human. But that's not really true, as the developers keep the anatomy of the Seisi purposefully vague throughout the games. You see, these people we see, basically all the Akaviri we see in the games, are almost all spirits from the late Riemann era and the Potentate era, meaning that many of these Akaviri are descendants of the Akaviri invaders, which, for as far as we know, were mostly male, if not all male. They interbreeded with the Imperials of Cyrodiil, but a crucial element in this is that in the Elder Scrolls universe, a child of a union among different races is almost always of the mother's race. And when I say almost, I literally mean like 99.99% of the times. Meaning that most second generation Seisi, the direct children of the invaders, must have all been human. Heck, Severin Shorak, the second Akaviri Potentate, son of Verstuche himself, could have been human with Seisi blood, simply because Verstuche likely had a human wife. So, while it's possible that they were not serpents, I personally find it likely that they are not fully serpents, that they're more like Argonians but then snakes, or something like that. This piece of information does not give definitive proof of that, as all the ghosts that we see are descendants of the invaders and not the invaders themselves.
Just to clear things up. And that is about all I can say about the town of Hakoshae. It's one of my personal favorite villages on Tamriel, and that's quite a high bar, as Tamriel has many really cool locations. And yet we're now going to cheat a little bit again, as we're moving ever so slightly away from Tamriel, as we're going to talk about the Painted Worlds, small and mysterious realms that exist in some paintings on Tamriel. So I think it counts, since, the paintings are on Tamriel, and the only way to access them is from Tamriel, so hey, it's my video. Shut up. Let's talk about the Painted Worlds.
Alright, so recently I was replaying Oblivion and I replayed the quest A Brush of Death, in which you enter the Painted World, a world inside a painting in which its painter got trapped with aggressive painted trolls that prevent him from escaping. I never really bothered thinking too critically about this quest, that I just assumed that it was something that the designers thought would be fun and then just never reference again and pretend it never happened. But strangely enough, that's not the case. In fact, this quest with the Painted World got references in almost every Elder Scrolls game since Oblivion. It's referenced in Skyrim, Elder Scrolls Online, and even in the Elder Scrolls Legends, and even in the official Elder Scrolls novel, Lord of Souls. That's 3 more games and 4 more mentions than Fargoth got outside of Morrowind, and people still talk about him, so I think it's definitely worth talking about this. You see, in Oblivion you enter the painting because the wife of the painter got concerned when her husband suddenly disappeared from his atelier. He was just nowhere to be found, with only his painting supplies and unfinished paintings left in the room. The painter, Ryth Latandas, is quite a celebrity around Cyrodiil. He is one of the Empire's most renowned painters, famous for his amazing, almost lifelike paintings of Cyrodiil's forests. So him going missing is quite a big deal. You then investigate his atelier and soon you discover that touching the painting on the easel transports you into the Painted World, a small realm filled with painted trees, hills, skies. Basically, you are in the painting, and it's actually quite a pretty little piece of Oblivion to walk around in my opinion at least. Well, in the Painted World you immediately find Ryth, who tells you that he's stuck inside the painting. He then reveals that he is not actually a real painter, but rather that he got his hands on a magical artifact that was passed down from his father to him called True Paint. A paintbrush, he says, that has been gifted to his father by the goddess Dibella after his father, who was an avid painter, lost his arms while fighting in a war. The paintbrush, which is allegedly made out of Dibella's own hairs, has the property of creating a world out of canvas, which can be entered by mortals, and inside this world he who holds the paintbrush can basically imagine anything they want, and it will appear life-size in the Painted World, and it will also appear on the canvas in the real world. That way Ryth was able to make all these amazing lifelike paintings. So this paintbrush was allegedly a gift from Dibella to his father, because his father was such a passionate painter, but without his arms, which he lost in the war, he wasn't able to paint, so Dibella gave him a brush that could do it for him instead. Alright, that's what he tells us at least. So for his entire career, all that Ryth had to do was just enter the canvas with True Paint, imagine scenery, and then paint a portal for himself to get back into the real world and leave the painting. And then once done with the painting, he just closes the entrance into the Painted World somehow, how exactly isn't described, and you get this perfect lifelike painting of anything that you could imagine while you were in there. Now, in the quest, it turns out that while he was working inside the Painted World, a thief who had presumably hidden himself in his atelier followed him into the painting, stole the brush of True Paint, and then fled further into the Painted World as he painted trolls to stop Ryth from chasing him as he ran, hoping that he could get far away enough from Ryth not to be able to catch him, and then paint a portal for himself to get out of the painting again. Well, unfortunately, his own trolls turned on him and then killed him on the edge of the Painted World, where you can literally see the blank canvas as he fell dead, murdered by the trolls that he himself painted. This left Ryth, who is not a fighter, stuck in the Painted World, as he could not retrieve True Paint from the thief's body due to the trolls being in his way. You, as the player, can then defeat the trolls. You return the brush to Ryth, and he paints the two of you out of that world by painting a portal out of the Painted World back to the real world. You then get a minor reward and quest done. But the questions begin here, because what exactly is going on here? First of all, do the paintings actually turn into paintings when he finishes them off and then closes off access to the Painted World? Or does True Paint just casually create these small realms and then he sells these small realms, which are closed off, as paintings? So essentially selling small closed off portals to these Painted Worlds, where you can only look inside them instead of being able to travel into them because he closed off access. Or do they turn into paintings in the same way how you can work on an image on your PC, so it's modifiable, and then print it using a printer, and then it's no longer modifiable because it's an actual image? Like, how does this work? And second question, what exactly are these Painted Worlds that you can enter? It seems highly unlikely that they are pocket realms of Oblivion, as Dibella, the alleged creator of the brush, is an Aedric goddess and not a Daedric lord, and Aedric realms are not really something that we see all that often, since their nature is so different to that of Daedric realms. I've seen people online speculate that it's possible that these Painted Worlds are realms created inside what is Dibella's planet or realm, as the Aedra allegedly have realms of their own circling Nirn-like planets in the mortal plane, which we don't really visit in any of the games. But even that is just completely up for debate, because we don't really know what the exact nature of these realms are and whether something like these pocket realms would be possible inside one of them. So yeah, what exactly these painted worlds are is a complete mystery. But the mystery gets even deeper, because some people have claimed that the painted world is simply a very complicated illusion spell, but you see, it's not that. Because the trolls, when you kill them, are able to fill a soul gem, meaning that true paint can somehow create souls, a brush which can create souls. But even if you think that that's just a game mechanic, it gets even better, because the trolls drop this rare ingredient that you can only obtain inside the painted world called painted troll fat, which has unique alchemical properties as opposed to normal troll fat, and you can take that outside of the painting without it disappearing, so things created inside the painted world can transfer outside of it into the Mundus, so that's the place Tamriel is in, the realm. And it's most definitely not a game mechanic, as in Skyrim, so the game after Oblivion, the Alchemist of Riften has dialogue saying that he has to contact Wraith Lathandas, you know, the painter that we just rescued in Oblivion. I mean, he's a Dark Elf, so it's logical that he's still alive by the time of Skyrim, considering their lifespans. But he has to contact him to get some painted troll fat, as it's a very rare and expensive ingredient that only Wraith sells and exports by the time of Skyrim. So even within the universe, taking things out of the painting is actually canon. Like, where does this stop? If painted trolls have a soul and they could theoretically leave the painting through a painted portal, just like their fat, does that mean that the one holding the brush could create intelligent beings as well? Say if you painted, or rather imagined, an Imperial soldier inside of the painted realm, like this man Wraith just casually uses his artifact to create paintings, but he might be holding the power of a literal god, if that works. But there's one final piece of the puzzle which we still haven't talked about and which hasn't been fitted into this whole story yet, specifically Wraith lying to us, or at least his father lying to Wraith about how they got the brush of true paint. Like I said, his father told Wraith that he got the brush from the Bella when he lost his arms in the war, so he would be able to continue to express himself in art. But if that's true, which is possible, I mean it's possible because all of Elder Scrolls is basically an unreliable narrator, then the final piece of the puzzle would be a massive coincidence. You see, in the Elder Scrolls Online we can find the journal of one Bravam Lathandas, a far ancestor of Wraith and his father, or maybe not even that far, since Dark Elves have a quite long lifespan. Thinking about it, it might even just be his grandfather, but we don't really know their family tree, like this doesn't go that deep. This journal of Bravam basically reveals that he was a Dunmer sorcerer who psychologically tormented some people that he kidnapped to try and research the effect of illusions on the mortal mind. He used powerful illusion spells and enchantments to have some people in his basement believe that they actually lived in an elaborate palace, and that they were in fact nobles and not just kidnapped by him. This started working after some experimentation, but after a few weeks his text subjects just started completely losing their minds, with one of them continually praying to Debella for relief. It's actually a really fucked up experiment. I can recommend reading the entire journal to find out how bad this dude was. Like, he convinced one of the test subjects that he would die if he took off the necklace which kept the illusion alive, so it's pretty nasty. Anyway, one day Bravam Lathandas entered his basement only to find that everything in it, his test subjects and all the furniture, was just gone, and every wall of the room was now painted, depicting large murals of the insides of an elaborate palace, with all that was left in the room being just a small paintbrush and some paint supplies, with that paintbrush obviously being true paint. This implies that someone or something intervened, gave the kidnapped test subjects true paint which allowed them to escape into a painted world depicting a palace in which they now truly wanted to live, but now away from the psychological torment of their captor. But this story implies that the brush has been in the possession of the Lathandas family ever since, for the subsequent 1000 years to Skyrim, handed down from parent to child every generation. This allowed the Lathandas family to become basically a lineage of famous painters, keeping the true powers of true paint a secret. Of course, this secret sometimes leaked out and people looked for the elusive brush over the ages, as we can witness in the Elder Scrolls Online, but nobody ever connected them to the Lathandas family, and they usually died before finding them. So what exactly is this brush of true paint? Well, the most straightforward explanation is that we can just trust the dialogue that is given to us, and that it's just an artifact of Dibella, originally given by Dibella as an act of mercy to the captives of Bravon Letandas, which allowed them to create a small pocket realm to live in away from their captor. This strengthens the theory that the Divines, or the Aedra, are still quite powerful at manipulating the Mundus, and at least have their own realms like the Daedra, as it would be likely that the Painted Worlds are just pocket realms of Dibella's realm, if it's truly an artifact of Dibella. Which acolytes of Dibella believe, by the way, that it's an artifact of Dibella, that is. But Elder Scrolls is full of unreliable narrators, and this whole ordeal kinda got me thinking. Save for some very specific incidents, the Divines don't really tend to interfere with the Mundus as much as the Daedric Princes do, for example, so it's also very possible that this artifact, True Paint, is not a Dibellan artifact at all, but it's rather assumed by the Ancestor of Right, Bravon Letandas, that Dibella gave it to his captives because one of the captives was just praying to Dibella all the time, but we don't know who actually gave the artifact. You see, I speculate that this might actually be a Daedric artifact, specifically one created by the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile. Remember, this is all speculation on my side, but I feel like an Aedric divine like Dibella, just disregarding the whole debate about the amount of power that the Divines still have, would not give an artifact like this just to some mortals and then leave it there in the room like that after the captives of Bravum actually escaped. This whole ordeal seems more like Clavicus Viles' MO. He is the Daedric Prince of Bargains and the embodiment of careful what you wish for. He enters pacts with mortals and grants them their wishes, but he's a trickster. And the wishes almost always come back to bite you if you're not very careful and precise in what you wish. This paintbrush inside the Painted World has literally unlimited potential, it seems, but it's also a double-edged sword, as we've seen, because remember, paint something dangerous like a troll, and if you don't know what you're doing, you get straight up murdered by your own creation. Not just that, I can imagine the captives of Bravum Letandas, after no answered prayers for their freedom from Dibella, just wishing that they were truly in the palace that they were imagining due to his illusions. So then Clavicus Vile appeared and fulfilled their wish, giving them the brush, not telling them that if they did not take the brush with them into the Painted World, they would literally never again be able to leave. And of course, the brush was left outside, locking the captives forever inside that Painted World of the palace. Of course, this is all speculation, but considering that this is an artifact which seems very nice on the surface, but can easily ruin your life, as remember, even the Wright himself, the guy that has the paintbrush in Oblivion, nearly got locked in his own Painted World forever, just never to escape again. I mean, it feels far more like a Clavicus Vile-like thing to do. That would also explain why Wright only makes paintings of nature and doesn't do any alive creatures or intelligent beings as far as we know, as perhaps the brush is even made in such a way that anything it paints which is alive would just attempt to kill the painter. I mean, I know trees are alive, but you know what I mean, like if you paint like animals or people, which would definitely be a Clavicus Vile thing to do, but considering that we only saw trolls being created, and trolls are just aggressive out of themselves, this is all just complete speculation, but hey, speculation is fun, and like I said, we have very little understanding of the Painted Worlds and True Paint, and what their true nature is, so please let me know in the comments what you think. This is a very open speculation kind of subject and everything is possible. But I really feel like after examining all the information that we have, that this feels far more like one of the tricks of Clavicus Vile and doesn't really feel like the intervention of Dibella. But, you know, let me know what you think. Perhaps you think something completely different. I'll be really looking forward to what you guys write in the comments, because some of you guys are very creative. And I often feel stupid about not thinking about certain things. So please let me know what you think.
And that was the story of the Painted Worlds. Now, next up, let's talk about what could well have been the very last attempt of the Ayleid elves to found a new city before they went extinct. The Ayleid city of Root Sunder.
So, the Ayleids, they were elves that lived in the central parts of Tamriel, occupying most of Cyrodiil, parts of Blackmarsh and parts of Valenwood, with even some smaller colonies across the rest of the continent. These elves, at one point during the First Era, had a massive empire comprised of many different Ayleid kingdoms, spanning almost the entirety of Cyrodiil and the areas in the bordering provinces. They were a proud people, and their massive empire functioned largely on slavery at the end of their empire, as the Ayleids tended to enslave humans and other races for their labor. Now, this system functioned pretty well for them, that is, until the human slaves, and presumably the other enslaved races as well, started a massive rebellion under Slave Queen Alessia. This rebellion led to a civil war within the Ayleid Empire, as when the slave rebellion took success after success, even some Ayleid kingdoms allied themselves with the rebellion against their brethren. This was supposedly due to a religious conflict over whether Ayleid should be worshipping Daedra or Aedra, but that's a topic for its own video. What is important to know, however, is that the humans won, and Ayleid power was no longer dominant in Cyrodiil, with the First Cyrodiilic Empire, the Alessian Empire, now taking a hold of the province under the former slave queen Alessia. Then, almost a century after the rebellion, the Ayleid kingdoms, which sided with the rebellion, were also abolished and largely hunted down when an anti-elf extremist faction called the Alessian Order took control over the empire. In this period, many Ayleids which still remained in Cyrodiil fled from Cyrodiil to the still existing Ayleid kingdoms in the northern parts of Valenwood, western parts of Blackmarsh, or they ended up fleeing to the Somerset Isles or High Rock, where large elvish populations of other races welcomed them into their society, and they eventually just disappeared in their society, interbreeding. This is what we call the late Ayleid period, and their population declined slowly in this period, between the first few centuries of the First Era towards the start of the Second Era. The last major Ayleid kingdom supposedly fell in the year 482 of the First Era, but Ayleid cities and smaller enclaves and colonies continued to exist in the coming centuries. We know, for example, that during the Reman Empire, which existed in the late First Era and partly in the early Second Era, Ayleids were once again welcomed in Cyrodiil, although there were precious few of them left at that point. We know, for example, that the Ayleid Charan Fear lived and worked within the Cyrodiilic University of Gwylim from the year 2790 of the First Era until the year 227 of the Second Era, and actually wrote academic books on his people, and he said that they were still living in small enclaves across Valenwood and Blackmarsh, although these enclaves, for all we knew, were very small and according to him operated in a tribal way. But it's important to realize that this guy lived and wrote this more than 2000 years after the fall of the last major Ayleid kingdom, meaning that the actual extinction of the Ayleids happened much more slowly than people generally assume, and that it was more of a steady population decline happening over centuries since the fall of their empire. Which brings us to the city of Sunder, one of the final Ayleid attempts at settlement. We know from Charan Fear and his writings that by this time many of the Ayleids who were left more than 2000 years after the fall of their final kingdom in recorded history lived in what resembled basically tribes, which is what likely led to their later nickname of the Wild Elves, which is what they're called in some of the Elder Scrolls games. One of these tribes, or a faction which split from those tribes, set off to build a new city for themselves in the year 291 of the Second Era, at a point where their society was basically nothing more than a few tribes, most likely. Considering we don't really see any living Ayleids in the Elder Scrolls Online, only 300 years or so later after the attempted founding of Sunder, it's very possible that this might have actually been the last surviving tribe, but the jury's still out on that one, as we don't really know how many tribes in other parts came to an end. Anyway, deep in the jungle of Valenwood, they wanted to build a new city for themselves, which would be functioning as a new base for them and most likely also as a trading hub with the local wood elves. But only a year or so after the foundation of this new city, which they had called Sunder, it disappeared entirely along with all of its inhabitants. In the coming centuries, scholars would search for the lost city of Sunder but would not find it anywhere, or the scholars searching for it would disappear. It had disappeared simply into the vast jungle of Valenwood, and none would find out what happened to the city. That is, until a group of scholars found it and discovered the city's quite tragic story. You see, when the Ayleid tribe arrived at the site in Valenwood where Sunder would be built, they found that the jungle was quite impenetrable. They weren't able to found the city there in any easy manner. When they attempted to build anything, the jungle was in their way, as if the jungle itself resisted being built in. Now, normally something like this would lead to a different site being chosen for the city, but not for the Ayleids, as this tribe, late in the existence of the Ayleids, still knew some of the powerful magic of their ancestors, and they managed to deduce that the jungle around them was actually controlled by gentle but firm jungle spirits. And using the magic of their ancestors, they found a way to bind these spirits together in a Welkin stone. And they then forced these jungle spirits to work for them, enslaving them to their will and using their power to aid in the construction of their new city. This actually worked really well. Using the enslaved spirits, their builders were able to dig deep among the roots of the jungle and start building deep chambers for their city, which at this point was also being partly built above ground as far as we know. They brought the Welkin Stone with the bound spirits to the deepest parts of their new city, where it could be most easily used to control the earth and the roots of the plants around them. But the Welkin Stone was then far away from the sunlight that the spirits actually craved and fed upon. Construction of the new city went really well, but after a few months of construction, suddenly the builders and their conjurers started mysteriously disappearing, vanishing without a trace one by one. And after a few months, only a handful of them were left, and progress on building the new city slowed to a crawl. The people that they sent to look for their lost brethren also disappeared, and eventually only one conjurer was left, who a few days after writing his last journal entry also went missing. Now, nobody ever heard of the tribe anymore, and any trace of the city soon vanished from the face of Tamriel. The city was gone, never to be found again. That is, until some Altmer scholars around the time of the Elder Scrolls Online unearthed the ruins and found the remains of several other expeditions which had found the ruins, but hadn't made it out to tell the tale of the ruins. In the Elder Scrolls Online, you as the player can help the final member of this expedition uncover what truly happened to the city of Root Sunder by delving into the ruins. And as you delve in, you discover that the gentle forest spirits which the Ayleid had bound to their will far away from sunlight had been driven mad by their imprisonment far away from the sun and within artificial walls that they really couldn't stand. They went mad with hunger and sneakily took control of parts of the city on their own and started devouring the builders' and conjurers' flesh to sate themselves. And when there were no longer any Ayleid builders or conjurers left to devour, these spirits were freed from their will, but they were still locked inside the stone and they were still locked inside the city. The spirits then had the earth that they could still control around the city swallow the city so that none would ever be able to find the city. And they then went to sleep as they had no energy left without either sunlight to feed on or flesh to consume. Each time a scholarly expedition found them and ventured inside the city that they now fully controlled, they awoke the spirits and they were consumed by the spirits, after which the mad spirits once again went back to sleep. You as the player are the first one to be strong enough to resist the dangers of the city and prevent the spirits from killing you with their vines and their animals under their control. Instead, you free the spirits, after which their sanity returns and they can once again feed upon the sunlight and they can once again merge with the jungle and the other spirits. This actually marks the end of the story of the city, as we finally know what happened to its inhabitants and the city's remains are finally safe for scholars to explore now that the spirit is no longer controlling them.
That was quite a lesson into the history of the now extinct Ayleid, so I think it's now an appropriate time to talk about another race which went extinct, the Kothringi humans. A human race native to Blackmarsh which had silvery metallic skin and went extinct a long time ago. And yet we can find a small village of them still alive in the Second Era, so that village definitely seems like a place we should explore in this video.
The story of Stillrise village begins back in the Merethic era, before even the Needs migrated to Tamriel from Atmora or the Altmer migrated to Tamriel from Altmuris. Back in these days, Tamriel was inhabited by only a few races, mostly beast races like the Argonians and the Khajiit. But there was actually also a human race native to southern Tamriel, the Kothringi. This race of humans primarily lived in Blackmarsh around this time, and they are known to have had a strange metallic colored skin, like you can see in the images that I'm using for this video. These humans are quite obscure and far from well known. Their influence on Tamriel's history has been very marginal, as they were mostly tribal for the most of their existence, just like the other lesser known beast race in Blackmarsh, the Lilmolith. Meanwhile, other races like the humans on Atmora and Yokuda, and of course the elf races on Altmuris and Yokuda, had already moved past their tribal phases and had started living in organized sedentary civilizations. At some point the Kothringi did become a bit more developed, as we'll touch on later, but their biggest contribution to Tamriel's history, as far as I know, is the fact that they brought worship of the god Zen to Valenwood, but even that is quite speculative, as it could also be that Valenwood brought it to the Kothringi. However, the most accepted theory is that the Kothringi brought it to Valenwood. This made it so that their civilization was relatively small and quite underdeveloped in comparison to the Khajiit civilization around this time, and the ancient Argonian Zenmir civilization, which existed on Tamriel around this time in the Merethic era. Their civilization would become a bit more advanced after human dominance on Tamriel began. Around this time we know that they had some significant cities and actually aided the Riemann Empire in their partial occupation of Blackmarsh. However, in the year 560 of the Second Era, their society would suddenly completely collapse. This was because of the Carnarthon flu, a mysterious disease originating in Blackmarsh, which killed off all of its inhabitants except for the Argonians, because the Argonians had been made immune by the Hist. This flu was actually so bad that the entire civilization of the Kothringi has been completely wiped out by it, just like the society of the Lilmolith, leaving Blackmarsh almost completely in the hands of the Argonians and the Hist. This is what brings us to Stillrise village, because a few small pockets of Kothringi society managed to survive through less than natural means. Stillrise village was one of the many tribal villages that the Kothringi still had outside of the cities that they had, and it took a while for the Carnarthon flu to reach them as they lived inland. However, a few decades before the event of Elder Scrolls Online, the flu ended up reaching them anyway. First were the children. They started dying quite quickly after the first couple of contractions of the disease. The village chieftain, Sulak, then orders the village shaman, Shira, to pray to their god, Ze'en, to save their people from the Carnarthon flu. Unfortunately for the people of Stillrise village, Ze'en did not answer their prayers, and the village continued to die out slowly, just like the rest of the Kothringi. The village chief was then desperate, and as her people continued to die out slowly, she ordered Shira, the shaman, to resort to a very desperate measure. The shaman was to pray to the Daedric prince, Clavicus Vile, in the ancient temple dedicated to him that was located near the village. The shaman prayed to him to make their people immune to the Carnarthon flu. Clavicus Vile, surprisingly, answered the prayer. But as with all of his granted wishes, there was a catch. To make the villagers immune to the disease, Clavicus Vile made them undead and trapped their souls in a soul gem array, a special device designed to contain the souls of the villagers. This made it so that the villagers were unaffected by the disease, but they were cursed to become undead, losing their ability to feel anything. No longer would they feel pain or get the symptoms of the flu, but also they would no longer be able to taste food, feel love, feel good, or feel bad. It would be impossible to die and forced to go on until eternity. They would be trapped forever in meaningless existence for as long as the souls of the villagers would be trapped in the soul gem array. It seems at first that they did not notice much, but over time they transformed into skeletons. They used magic to hide their skeletal appearance from outsiders, and over time the curse would cause a divide in the village. Most people in the village, like the shaman and the chieftain, would grow to hate the curse, and they would search for a cure in the coming decades, or a solution to their situation. The shaman and her assistants researched the soul gem array for years, but they could not find a cure, as Clavicus Vile, as usually, did his work well. Others in the village really valued the curse, and they saw it as a great opportunity. The village war chief, for example, saw their eternal life and impossibility to die as a unique chance to become perfect warriors that would hone their skills over the years. Since they cannot die or feel any pain, the warriors can simply train on each other with actual weapons, being able to hurt each other but then regenerate when they die as a result of the training. The war chief says that the chieftain and the shaman should stop looking at what they once were, and that they should rather rejoice for their gift and look at what the villagers could become if they put their mind and energy to it. The village lived in this state for several decades, one half of the village despairing and looking for a cure, the other training to become the strongest that they could, until one day, during the events of the Elder Scrolls Online, necromancers of Mannimarco's Wormkilt show up. The necromancers from Mannimarco attack the village, and during their attack they steal the soul gem array in order to manipulate the villagers into slavery, as they would hold power over the souls of the villagers if they had the soul gem array. It is in this state in which the player of the Elder Scrolls Online can find the village. The soul gem array is stolen by the worm cult, and the village basically in a state of emergency. The player can then help to get the soul gem array back to the village chief in the quest The Thin Ones in the game. Because the soul gem array cannot be touched by the living, the player then actually has to temporarily become undead themselves with the help of Clavicus Vile and a weird ritual. The player then has to kill some worm-killed necromancers while they are undead and take back the soul gem array to the village. Once you bring back the soul gem array, however, you return to the village while it's a bit in turmoil. The shaman and the war chief are asking a chieftain to step down because of the theft of the soul gem array, as she would technically be responsible for its bad security as the chieftain. The war chief and the shaman both wish to determine the future of the tribe. The shaman would like to see the soul gem array destroyed. This would mean the entire tribe would die, but their souls could find rest. Meanwhile, the war chief would like the soul gem array to be placed in an eternal stasis, so that they will forever be immortal without any option to ever die again. As her final act as chieftain, Sulak appoints the player as an arbiter to resolve the conflict between the war chief and the shaman. The player can then choose to place the array in the fires of destruction or in the ice of stasis. If destruction is chosen, you will need to fight the war chief and his warriors on your way to the fire, who are trying to stop you from killing everyone in the town. If you choose to condemn them to eternal immortality and being undead forever, you will have to fight the shaman and the town mages on your way to the fire. In either scenario, you will complete the quest and receive the rewards. I personally chose to kill them, as it seems that the majority of the villagers, including the chieftain, seems to think that this type of existence is actually quite meaningless, and I feel personally worse for condemning them to go on forever than the alternative and ending it quickly. But, you know, I suppose that everybody has to make their own choice for themselves when doing this quest. To be honest, the reward is pretty cool. You get a polymorph for a skeleton, so you actually get like the curse of the village at will.
That said, that was the story of Stillrise village. Now let's talk about the city left behind by another extinct race, and this time it's one that you may all be a bit more familiar with. Let's talk about the Silent City, or better known as that Dwemer city in the cave of Blackreach in Skyrim.
Deep under Skyrim, stretching under several holds, lies a large underground cavern, which is home to the ancient Dwemer city of Fal Zarum Din, or Blackest Kingdom Reaches, usually just called Blackreach. The origins of this ancient kingdom lie in the early First Era, around the year 200, when the Dwemer living in Skyrim, likely some of the Dwemer at the city-state of Ralbethar, accidentally dug into the large underground cavern during a mining operation. They found a massive cave filled with large fungi, underground rivers and strange ores that spanned across almost half of Skyrim. The massive cave probably seemed like the ideal place to make an underground kingdom to rule, and working together, the Dwemer soon made tunnels and transportation, connecting some of their largest cities to the underground complex of Blackreach. The city-states of Alftant, Mazinchaleft and Ralbethar are still accessible from the large cavern. However, it's theorized that many other city-states were actually once accessible from the cavern, like Arkhamtans, Mzulft and Betar-Zel, but these entrances have now supposedly collapsed or flooded, as the Dwemer were not around to maintain the entrances. Soon after making the connections between the city-states, a large city was being built inside of the cavern, Far Zarum Din, which seems to have served as a sort of capital and neutral ground between the city-states, as we can for example find an ancient debate hall in which representatives of the city-states might have once met each other. Within this large cavern, a whole new underground Dwemer kingdom came to be. Several cities like Ralbethar expanded their own city limits into the caverns with deep markets, and in the middle of the large caverns stood a large new capital. Pumping stations with gigantic steam-powered water pumps were constructed to control the rivers and lakes in the caverns, and new crops, mostly mushrooms, that could grow in the dark were farmed on many fields in the cavern, all connected to the Dwemer city-states by a large new road system that was constructed across the cavern. Many people even theorized that the Dwemer might have sailed with steam-powered boats over the rivers and lakes. However, while that is possible, I personally think that this wasn't the case, as we cannot find any docks anywhere in the large cavern. However, it's possible that it happened, I just don't really view it as likely, since we can't find any traces of it. The new capital was also illuminated by a large spherical light that was hung above the city, like an artificial sun, and it's most often referred to as the sun nowadays when you're in the cave of Blackreach. Alongside these great construction projects came scientific achievements, as the Dwemer built the Great Tower of Mzark with its sky dome here in the center of Dwemery culture of Skyrim, where the Elder Scrolls reading mechanism that the Dwemerers invented was placed. By far the greatest achievement of all, however, was Aetherium and its extraction. Blackreach was over the centuries of it being inhabited still heavily used for mining, as many rare ores could be found, and even raw soul gems could be mined here, which was most likely one of the main reasons for the Dwemer to settle here in the first place, as most of their mechanical animalculi are all powered by soul gems, and thus having a reliable source for them would be very handy. However, among these rare minerals, they discovered a powerful raw material, Aetherium. a mineral bursting with magical energy, but useless to blacksmiths as it could not be crafted with, as it seemed impossible to melt or to reshape or unlock its magical energy. But what seems impossible to others is merely a challenge to overcome to the ancient Dwemer. 4 of the great Dwemer city-states banded together in an endeavor to make weapons made from Ethereum a reality. The cities of Arkantams, Muzulft, Ralfbethar and Betharzel coordinated to find a way to work the Ethereum. Arkantams did all the planning and research, Muzulft was apparently a sort of storage site, and Ralfbethar made sure that the mining operations went smoothly. We don't know exactly what Betharzel did, however some theorize that it's been some sort of experimentation facility. After a while, this endeavor succeeded and they designed an Ethereum forge. A forge that functioned using magma of Nirn's core that would be piloted by a large centurion. This project worked, and powerful weapons were created using the Ethereum. This however led to conflict, and conflict led to war, as the 4 city-states who had banded together for science went to war over the Ethereum, ultimately only weakening the Dwemer civilization, and to our knowledge none emerged victorious in the end. When the Ethereum Wars were finally over, the Nordic High King Galir used the Dwemer's current weakness to conquer the Dwemer city-states, including Blackreach, making it so that the Dwemer basically lost their independence in Skyrim. Blackreach was now, for the next 100 years or so, under the control of the Nords. However, after another 100 years, after little more than a century, the Dwemer took back Blackreach when they ousted the Nords from their city-states. For the following period, the city most likely acted as a connection between the remaining city-states, still serving as its capital function. However, no more attempts at refining Ethereum were made by the Dwemer, most likely because they saw the destruction that it brought to their society before. Years later, when the Falmer had been enslaved by the Dwemer, they rebelled against the Dwemer, and then the first rebel snow elf sought refuge in the darkest corners of Blackreach, regrouping until they would find a way to fight their Dwemer masters. They then struck back at their Dwemer masters, and for years a war raged under the surface of Skyrim. Blackreach was then the stage of this bloody war, that would be called the War of the Crag, a war between the blind Falmer and the Dwemer, which was mainly fought on the fields of Blackreach. When the Dwemer disappeared, the Falmer spread to the previously inaccessible places and became the occupants of many cities and buildings around the cavern. For the centuries after that, Blackreach remained largely sealed. A few travelers and adventurers would come across it by accident, seeing the large underground Dwemer city with its mostly still functioning animalculi, lighting and other systems, and they would refer to it as the Silent City, because all the machinery was working but there was not a soul to be found except for the Twisted Falmer. Over the years, this city faced the same fate as most Dwemer cities, its machinery endlessly continuing and not being maintained until it's basically worn out, resulting in some of the systems being broken and others still functioning with screeches until they too will inevitably one day stop functioning. The worn out pumping systems and support systems have been theorized to be the cause for the collapsing and floods for other entrances to the cave, leaving us only with the 4 lifts that are present in the game of Skyrim. While that is largely the story of Blackreach, there is one more thing that we need to discuss. Vultujorl, the large ancient dragon that appears when the artificial sun hanging over the Silent City is hit by an unrelenting force shout. We don't know how this dragon got into the caverns. Most likely he crammed himself through one of the now flooded entrances to escape the slaughter of the dragons by the Nords and the Dragon Guard. But another theory states that wouldn't have been possible, since most likely the hallways would have been too small for a dragon to even reach Blackreach. And these people theorize that he might have been captured by the Dwemer to experiment on his soul, or maybe just keep as a pet, as the Dwemers are the masters of soul manipulation and a dragon soul might have been valuable to them. Whichever it is, we unfortunately don't know which one it is, as the matter of how he got there remains unsolved. That's basically all that we know about Blackreach. The only other thing that I actually want to mention are the Crimson Nirn roots that we can find exclusively in Blackreach. However, I mentioned a great deal on them in my video on Nirn roots, so if you want to know more about that, then I would check out that video.
And that's about all I can say about the Silent City and Blackreach, and by now it's time to end this long lore collection video. With these kind of videos I always wonder, if people truly watch these videos all the way to the end, so if you did watch it all the way until this point, How about you comment under this video with your favorite type of food? Not only will it be super confusing to other people who didn't watch up until this point, it may also just give me some ideas for new meals other than my standard rice and vegetables. Now I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this long lore collection of my previous work, why not subscribe to the channel and watch my regular content. I make weekly Elder Scrolls lore videos where I try to teach you something new about this world that I'm way too obsessed with.
Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon subscribers, Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Athena Iodis, Doji, Fenrir, King Chris, Pavel T, Pentam Gwar, Volkir of Argonia, Leo Worley, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen keep this channel alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.